I know some of you are probably looking around thinking, gee, why is attendance so low this morning? Well, there are 54 female members of our spiritual community that are on a women's retreat this weekend, so that's what's going on. I got a text from Reverend Carla last night saying there's some powerful healing going on, as well as people just going a lot deeper into their spiritual awareness. That's good to hear. Yeah, so good morning. Back in 1904, something very simple happened, but it would have an amazing consequence. There was a 13-year-old boy walking home from school in rural Kansas, and he tripped and skinned his knee. Now, didn't seem like a big deal to him at the time, and after all, he was a tough Kansas boy. And so he just let it go. But the next morning when he got up, there was a lot of pain and stuff. But like his other three brothers, he had to be up by 6 in the morning to do the chores in the barn and stuff before to eat breakfast and go off to school. So that's what he did. Then the next day it got a little bit worse. And then finally, Sunday rolled around, and he was not feeling well. And he just, he told his mom just he wasn't feeling well, and so she knows that he's usually pretty honest about that sort of thing. So she said, okay, well, you stay home, but, pick out your Bible passages for this week. And he as well as his other brothers would alternate coming up with a passage from the Old Testament and from the New Testament, and then they would alternate each evening going over the passages and talking about what it meant. And she said, some of the discussions were really exciting, is the way he put it. Because you got to remember, this is 1904, no internet, no TV, no radio. Back in those days, people would read or they'd have conversations in the evening. So, but as the day went on, he was getting slowly and slowly worse, and went to bed and had a severe fever. And when he refused dinner, his mother got him to fess up as to what was going on, and he showed her his skinned knee. But not only was it a skinned knee at that point, his whole leg from about the thigh down was swollen. And so she put some cold compresses on his head, and then of course put warm compresses on his knee and called the doctor. The doctor came and looked things over, and the doctor was really concerned. He's like, boy, this is not good. He says, in fact, it's gone so far now, I think we may need to amputate. And the 13-year-old boy sprung up in his bed. What does that mean? He says, it means we may need to cut off your leg. He goes, no way, I'm not going to have my leg cut off. And the doctor realized he shouldn't really be talking in front of the kid, so he takes the parents out into the hallway. Now, the 13-year-old boy had an older brother, 1 year older than him, Ed. And the three boys shared the bedroom. There was also a younger 6-year-old and 5-year-old brother. And so he calls Ed over and says, Ed, whatever you do, I want you to promise me you will not let them cut my leg off. Even if I go unconscious, even if I go nuts, I do not want my leg cut off. I'd rather die than have my leg cut off. And Ed certainly understood. Think about this. This is rural Kansas. They're out on a farm. I mean, the thought of operating without a leg was just, they couldn't comprehend that. So suddenly Ed sets up sentry outside the door. His parents and the doctor are out in the hallway talking, look at him. He said, what are you doing? He says, I'm guarding the door. There's no way you're cutting my brother's leg off. And the doctor's saying, well, that's all fine and good, but he may die. And he says, well, I made him a promise, and that's what I'm going to follow through on. So for the next 48 hours, Ed guarded the door. He did allow the doctor in to see his brother, but that night when they were standing in the hallway, his parents realized, wow, we've been so wrapped up in his medical condition, we haven't been praying. And so his mother, his father, and his older brother, Ed, prayed together, and then they decided to start a prayer vigil. And every 2 hours, one of them would be in prayer, and they'd alternate. And then, of course, the 5 and the 6-year-old wanted to be involved. And for those next 48 hours, it just looked like things were getting worse. But then suddenly, the doctor came by one day, and he noticed a difference. He says the fever was lower. And he said, yeah, I think he's going to be okay. And the doctor joined them in a prayer of thanksgiving for what he was seeing. It would be 3 weeks before the 13-year-old boy could stand up and walk around. In fact, he ended up missing enough school that he had to repeat a grade in high school. But consider for a moment if there were less patience in that household, or no patience at all. Consider if they had followed the doctor's prognosis and gone ahead and amputated the leg. Also consider that an experience like that tends to help a person build faith, courage, and resolve to handle any situation thrown at them. And if that leg had been cut off, it literally would have changed the world. This boy wanted to go to college. His brother Edgar, of course, was a year ahead of him. And they worked out a deal. They would work to get up enough tuition so that each of them could go to college. Ed would start the first year, then he'd come back and work so that his brother could go to college, and they would alternate years until they were done with college. So Ed went off to college, and his brother worked at a creamery, worked as a night supervisor. But after the first year, Ed came back and pleaded with his brother. Is it okay if I continue another year? And the scene of George Bailey and It's a Wonderful Life kind of jumps back into my head. You know, the older brother, he's letting his brother continue. So his brother continues. And at one point he was having a conversation with one of his friends about, what he and his brother were doing, and he's kind of frustrated, but, he loved his brother and wanted him to succeed. And the friend said, well, there is a place you can go and get a college degree without having to pay any tuition. And you can either go to the Naval Academy or to the Military Academy, West Point. And so he found out what he had to do, and he got the senator of Kansas, to write a recommendation for him. And he was all gung-ho. He's thinking, I'm going to go Navy. But it turns out because he had waited a couple years after finishing high school, he was too old to enter the Naval Academy. So it would have had to have been West Point. And sure enough, West Point accepted him, and he went off to West Point. Wasn't that good of a student. In fact, he had a difficulty following the rules. Was kind of just an average student, but he graduated in, it was 1915. And he wanted, of course, to be involved in the First World War. But he was given assignments to where he didn't make it to Europe, and finally they sent him to Europe, but it was at the end of the war, so he didn't see any combat. And he was frustrated. But then for the next 23 years, as many of his fellow military students, ended up leaving the military to go into the private sector, he was building a career in the Army. They found that he had a very good sense of people, a good judge of character, could really assess what a person's talents were, what their strengths and weaknesses were, and he was very organized. And he was part of a young group of officers who were advocating a different way of using tanks in warfare. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor happened, and we were thrust into World War II. And this young man who almost had his leg cut off was assigned the task of invading Europe. This man's name was Dwight David Eisenhower. And of course, Eisenhower went on to become the President of the United States in 1952. See, none of this would have happened if there had not been enough patience and faith in that critical week, or actually more of a critical 4 weeks, in a 13-year-old boy's life. There is patience in the physical world, but then there's also patience in the spiritual world. And in the spiritual world, patience is essentially a trust that God works, that Spirit works. It's not easy. I mean, we live in a society of instant gratification. I have to laugh when I hear people complaining about their computer taking 30 seconds to get to wherever it is they're getting. You know, being a child of the 60s and 70s and becoming a journalist in the 1970s and just praying that there would be some way that I could correct the scripts that were being kicked out of my typewriter, and rather than having to retype the whole page. But over time, we learned to let go. It's not that big of a deal. The problem was we shifted from an organic orientation, of course, with an agricultural-based economy, to mechanic. Organic to mechanic. Suddenly the Industrial Revolution, if a machine is broken, you just replace it, you fuel it, whatever. And so we don't experience patience as much anymore in the physical world. Now, for farmers, for gardeners, they know you have to plant a seed and you have to be patient. You have to nurture the ground even though there's nothing happening. It would not be a good idea to dig up the seed every day to see how it's doing. And I find for a lot of people, when things aren't going their way for a while, they're tempted to give up. In the New Testament letter to the Romans, Paul wrote in the 8th chapter, 24th verse, "Now hope that is seen is not really hope. For who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But the Spirit intercedes for us with an exhalation too deep for words. We know that in everything God works for good with those who love Him." One of the odd things about meditation and prayer is how long will it take? I've seen times where there's almost instantaneous response to prayer. I've seen other times where it takes 48 hours or 3 weeks, but I've also seen times where it's taken years. Why is that? I don't know. And neither do you, but isn't it interesting that it works? If I would speculate, and what I usually coach people on, is that the reason you haven't seen results is because the proper sequence of events haven't happened yet to provide you with the right opportunity. Now, there have been a number of times, I've shared with you how Carl and we served this congregation down in Florida in 2006. We were guided to just move back to the Midwest for a few months near headquarters, Unity's headquarters in Kansas City, and find a congregation to serve. And it took 4 years. And we interviewed at 8 congregations. But what was happening was we had to wait for Indianapolis to open up. And the oddity was in our travels doing seminars all through the 90s, there were 3 congregations that we really resonated with, and all 3 of them came open that year. One of them didn't even want to do a phone interview with us. Another one, we actually did go in as finalists for the interview weekend, but we recognized that it was not the right place for us. And they seemed to recognize the same thing. And then a few weeks later, we came to interview here in September of 2010, and it became very obvious why we had been waiting for 4 years. I would stamp my foot at God many times. I have not mastered this patience thing, but it was like, yeah, looking back in retrospect, wow. And then just hearing what did happen at those other 2 congregations after, and we came here, and we were in the right place. The other interesting thing about the Eisenhower story is that the general guidance or consensus was don't amputate the leg. Now, you may have a health challenge in your life where you may get different guidance. I have done spiritual coaching or counseling for people on a lot of different illnesses or just aging. It's amazing how many times I've been with someone who's aged, their body is just kind of failing, and their prayer is, why am I not dead yet? It's kind of stunning, and I find most of the time I'm the first person they've admitted that to. And what I'll coach them to do is that one of two things needs to happen. Either one, you need to teach somebody something. So if you're getting an inner guidance, go ahead and contact that person, let them know what you need them to know. Or somebody needs to share something with you. So if somebody contacts you and wants to talk with you, take them up on it. But if we're willing to open up our mind to the divine mind, we get divine ideas. And divine ideas work. And there's only two things that we need to do to have a divine idea expressed in our life. And one, believe that divine ideas exist. And number two, be willing to express them. You see, for God to work, more often God has to work through us. Through that guidance. We're guided to do something. And then other times, not so much. We just need to be patient. Patience. God grant me patience and grant it to me right now. Three other aspects of patience is that, yes, we need to be patient with others. We need to be patient with God. And yes, we need to be patient with ourselves. And often it's ourselves that we have the hardest time being patient with. There's a great quote from Emerson. Most of the shadows of this life were caused by standing in our own sunshine. In order to have a great outlook, we need to have a great in-look. And a great in-look is just trusting that God, Spirit, universe is stronger than anything we're facing. Confucius said, our greatest glory is not in avoiding a fall, but in rising every time we fall. And I have not mastered this, as I mentioned, and I remember a Unity minister talking about how he was in a hurry to get someplace, and he was driving through Missouri, and he was running late and frustrated, and all of a sudden he hits this little town on the outskirts of Kansas City, and there's a traffic jam. And he's like, what the? And he's sitting there, and he's frustrated. He's like, oh, come on. He's looking out, and trying to see what's going on. Traffic is moving really slow, well, maybe 5 miles an hour, and then traffic turns, and he turns with it, and he realizes he's at the tail end of a parade. And he's thinking, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right, and I'm going to enjoy it. And he rolled down the windows and was waving to everybody as he's going down. God has a sense of humor, and sometimes it's just a matter of that there is a divine order in you being delayed. There are countless stories of people who were diverted or delayed, and sure enough, it was because they needed to be in a specific spot in a specific time. The Old Testament book of Proverbs, 16th chapter, 32nd verse says, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit is better than he who takes a city. Another aspect of patience, of course, is coping with change. And of course, the only constant in life is change. Things will change. We'll be pushed out of our comfort zones. In the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, 10th chapter, 35th verse, therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you will have need of patience and endurance, so that you may do the will of God and receive what is promised. So regardless of our situation, when something does happen to us, are we willing to just open our mind to the divine mind? Are we willing to say to ourselves, okay, show me the good in this situation. What is mine to do? What is mine not to do? What is mine to say? What is mine not to say? We are faith-filled and patient as divine guidance leads each of us into our highest good. So open your mind to the divine mind. Our closing story is a 3-minute video from Steve Hartman of the CBS Evening News about another person who was given a death sentence by doctors and a son who was guided to patiently do something to make things better.
After 50-year-old Steve McKee was diagnosed with an incurable form of cancer last year, his oldest son Mitch took it upon himself to try to make the disease disappear.
Thank you.
if only for a moment.
Kind of flush it all away and kind of have him forget about it for that moment and have everybody forget about it for that moment. Just be happy.
It was a plan only a 15-year-old boy could hatch. Knowing how proud dads can be when their sons do well in sports, Mitch, a wrestler, decided he would try to win a Minnesota State High School Wrestling Championship for his dad, even though Mitch was only a freshman at the time.
He might not be here next year, so I knew that this was the year to do it.
This colossally ambitious undertaking began in the weight room. All summer, Mitch got up every morning at 6 a.m. to lift, and he practiced. Even when there wasn't practice, he practiced. As a result, Mitch won his first match of the season, and his second. In fact, the kid won so many matches, he not only qualified for the state tournament, he made it to the finals. And this was it. All he needed to do was win this one last match and he'd be the state champion in his weight class. All he needed to do was pin this one last opponent, and that cancer, for a moment, would disappear. After the match, even the losing wrestler did a winning thing. He congratulated Mitch's dad, told him to stay strong, while Mitch, on the other hand, had far fewer words. He held his dad. Just held him.
For him to do it for me, it was very emotional. All the emotions that you can ever have right there.
You forget you were sick?
Was I?
Yeah, life was definitely perfect at that moment, you know. I just wanted to stay right there forever, you know.
Mitch McKee definitely did right by his dad. But he had one thing all wrong. He thought he needed a huge victory to make his dad feel better.
Amen.
When all he really needed was the love behind it.
That was joyful.
Steve Hartman, On the Road, near Minneapolis.
The New Testament letter to the Romans, 8th chapter, 26th verse. Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But the Spirit intercedes for us with an exhalation too deep for words. We know that in everything, God works for good with those who love him. And may you always be open to God's guidance and grace. It is now time for our tithes and offerings. So take a moment now to consciously think and feel abundance as you get ready to give. If you use the electronic giving on our website, unityofindy.com, and click on the Donate tab, just hold whatever amount you're giving there in your heart and in your mind. If you're going to be giving a check or cash or gold doubloons, just hold them in your hands right now. Open your heart and pour love into them. Know that you are abundantly supplied, and that anything we give unconditionally and in love comes back to us multiplied at least 100 times. And then let's say the affirmation on the screen together. Divine love, through me, blesses and multiplies all that I am, all that I give, all that I receive, and I am grateful.
There's a place in our hearts where we all search for love, even when the journey seems to shake our strength. And we know there's a place within each of our souls where the love never ends, never breaks our faith. Thank you, God, for everything, every tree, every seem to close when the train rolls on down the tracks of strife. Well, we know there's a higher place where the eagle soars, where the crows fall away and our souls take flight. Thank you, God, for everything, every tree, every child, every animal, every day, every flower, every song, every way, every breath that I take. Thank you, God, for the unity of this place. In our joy, in our pain, in our misery, this is time to be inside, to bring peace. Just the Christ is the freedom that we all shine through. God is all, everything, to remember the truth. Thank you, God, for everything, every tree, every child, every animal, every day, every flower, every star, every way, every breath that I take. Thank you, God, for the unity of this place. Thank you, God, for everything, every tree, every child, every animal, every day, every flower, every star, every way, every breath that I take. Thank you, God, for the unity of this place. Thank you, God, for the unity of this place. Thank you, God. Thank you, God, for the unity of this
Thank you, David, the whole spirit of praise, David. And I think I could feel Denise Sherman on the other side who wrote that song.
I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you from the storms and strife to the peace and light. When the road is dark, when confusion abounds, I'll surround your life with the love that resounds, and I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. Come into my door, shake your walls of fear. It's the gift you bring from the love most high that's here. When the angels speak, stop and listen to their plight. God's messenger may be just within your sight, singing, I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. If you come into my gates with a heart that's open wide, you will be filled with miracles and overflowing holy light. Open up your eyes, believe, receive the light of the Lord. Everyone has moments of doubt. Change your thoughts and you will change your world. And I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. There's a peace that grows like a sunflower seed, begins small and soft, growing tall as the trees. It leads towards the sun. Warm and gentle rains fall down, ever cleansing my soul and nourishing my crown. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you. I will shelter you for the rest of your life.